Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CLEAR/CURES seminar series from Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. We are going to get started in about 2 more minutes. I'm going to give people another minute or two to sign into the Zoom, and then I will start with an introduction about today's seminar. So just give us a moment and we'll get started.
And Abby, when you do get questions, if you would repeat the question, because sometimes those of us online can't hear them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Melissa, everything is online today.
Oh, well, then we should hear it, for Pete's sakes.
So yeah, if it's in chat, either Lynn or I will be reading the question.
Okay.
And everybody, yeah.
There's no excuse for not hearing it then.
Well, let's just say if you start not hearing things, you better put a note in the chat because it means something weird is going on with our internet connection.
Yeah. All right.
Yes.
Good idea.
All right. Well, the 12:30 hour has rolled around and we are now ready to get started with our CLEAR and CURES seminar series here at the iBio building at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. I'm Carol Miller, and I'm one of the co-directors of our P42 CLEAR Center. And I do that directorship along with my colleague, Dr. Melissa Runge Morris. So we welcome you here today. And I have the privilege of introducing our speaker for today, Abby Hendershott, Executive Director of the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team. Many of us know that as MPART. Abby is a 32-year veteran of the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, which again we know as EGLE. And she's the executive director, as I said, of the PFAS Action Response Team. MPART is a multi-agency task force charged with investigating PFAS contamination, overseeing cleanup and other response activities aimed at protecting Michigan's drinking water. Abby has focused on PFAS response activities since 2017 and led the team responsible for Michigan's largest PFAS contamination response to date, the investigation into the former Wolverine Worldwide tannery in Rockford, Michigan. She holds a BS in Resource Development from Michigan State University and is a graduate of the Michigan State Great Lakes Leadership Academy. I must say I've had wonderful experiences working with Abby in the past on PFAS issues in the state. As most of you in the audience know, our CLEAR Center is really focused on VOC contaminants and vapor intrusion and the impact of those contaminants, especially on maternal fetal health. But many of us in CURES and CLEAR are also very involved in PFAS issues in the state. And so we've really appreciated that collaboration that we have with MPART. So Abigail, I turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Carol. You can hear me all right?
We can hear you very well.
All right. Excellent. Thanks, everybody, for having me today. Yeah, as Carol said, I'm Abby Hendershott, Executive Director for MPART. And I've got a lot of slides today. I'm going to go through them really quickly, but we will share the slide deck. And I'm trying to leave some time for questions and answers at the end so that everybody has a chance to get their questions answered. So if you've seen any of my presentations before, this will look similar, but you know, when we talk about PFAS, there's a lot of really big challenges. We've made a lot of progress in the state of Michigan as well as in the country. So I'm going to go through some of those PFAS basics very quickly, routes of exposures, because most of you are going to be in the health field or in some, advanced science in and around PFAS and or VOCs. And so you're going to understand this. And then we'll talk about what we've done for a strategy in Michigan, all of the sampling we've talked about, some of the health studies that I'm going to preview for you coming up for another talk in May from our colleagues at Department of Health and Human Services. And then I'm going to wrap up talking about residential wells, because I think there's a lot of need to make sure we're highlighting some of those for your thoughts in some of your future investigations as well. So when we talk about PFAS science, it is very much complex. There is no easy way to explain PFAS science, and just saying it's a forever chemical is a great injustice, because it's not a forever chemical, but it is a very complex, and the science is still evolving. The data is still evolving. Many of you are already involved in research, which I greatly appreciate, because we have to have more research to understand truly sources of PFAS, fate and transport, the health implications, and associated effects. How do we clean this stuff up? What kinds of policies and regulatory statutes do we need in place? How do we identify it? We're talking about, a family of compounds that's very large. So lots of things to consider. All of that has to happen in this collaboration space, because we can't do it alone. So let's go through some basics. MPART is really a unique, one of a kind, as far as I still know, in the country. And we were established in actually 2017 as an executive directive under Governor Snyder, and then made an enduring body in 2019 under Governor Whitmer with the Executive Order 2019. It's a multi-agency approach, and I'll talk about that here in a minute, but it allows us to all collaborate, communicate, and strategize on implementation of PFAS work in the state of Michigan. And that has really put us out in the forefront of the PFAS work, because we've had so much success and work done underneath the MPART purview. So when we talk about who's part of MPART, we have 7 different agencies that all have something to do with PFAS. Obviously, transportation would be all of our airports. Natural resources is, our fish, our wildlife, our waters. Agriculture, of course, our farms and our food processing. Our local public healths are our boots on the ground. Our military sites are, obviously all of the DOD, guard bases, Air Force bases, all of those things that we've got in the state. We've got over 30 of them in the state. State public health, I don't need to explain that. Our Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. And then our licensing and regulatory affairs is where the fire service, our fire marshal, is housed. So they all have something that needs to be addressed during our collaborative conversations. And so it's been a really good way to make sure that we're not at odds with each other. And so MPART doesn't have a regulatory oversight role. We simply allow the agencies to do their work under the law, but all working towards a common goal and in one direction. So one of the other really challenging things about PFAS is you're not talking about one chemical, you're talking about thousands of chemicals, which makes a nice little alphabet soup. And so they all have different properties, they all have different, toxicity levels. And so it's not an easy thing to tease apart or to try to explain. So we know the basics of PFAS, very strong carbon fluorine bonds. They act as surfactants. They're very, very stable in the environment, which is why the news media likes to call them forever chemicals. We know that depending on how you define PFAS, you could be talking about 10,000 to 15,000 different PFAS. We aren't using that many in our industries right now, but they are out there, and they could potentially, you could potentially have those degradation products or stuff. Widespread through the ecosystem, yes. We find PFAS in soils. We can find PFAS in groundwater, in all kinds of different animals. We find it in ourselves. They don't break down easily. That is true. And they do bioaccumulate. Not all PFAS, but certain PFAS will build up in our bodies and build up in fish and animals. The health effects, we're still trying to get our hands wrapped around that. A lot more emerging science and information than we used to have. And we have now MCLs. We have now drinking water standards at the federal level that are going to help continue to further this conversation around PFAS. So when you talk about PFAS, there's all kinds of, one of the other challenges that comes with PFAS is that this isn't just an industrial chemical or family of chemicals. You're talking about many, many different chemicals that are used in all kinds of household products. They're in our houses. And so we're already being exposed to them on some level from, the spray coating on our couches to make it stain resistant, from the carpets on our floors, to the paint on our walls, to the clothing, the cleaning products, the nail polish removers, the outdoor gear, all of the strippers and the sealants are all going to have PFAS in them. Your car seats usually come pre-sprayed for children so that they're not messing up the car seats with their food and beverages. And then obviously the nonstick cookware is something that we think about all the time. And then food packaging. So there's so many different routes of exposure when it comes to PFAS that we don't even know about yet, that it just really makes conversation around the health consequences or the health associations a very difficult and challenging discussion with our residents. What we do know is that our largest route of exposure is going to be through drinking contaminated water. Eating fish is also going to be an exposure to PFAS. We know that there's probably some incidental swallowing of contaminated soils and or dust in the houses. Eating food packaged with PFAS materials, some consumer products. It's hard to get a gauge on that because everybody's use of consumer products and or makeup and cosmetics is all different. But we do know that PFAS absorption through the skin is not typically a concern. PFAS, goes through the skin very, very slowly. And so the skin's a pretty good barrier for most of our exposure. We do know that just about everybody in the country has, unless you've been really living off the grid, has some level of PFAS in our blood. And that's because of the consumer products. That's because of, maybe you're eating a lot of fish. And so, but we know those levels are coming down, but there are replacement chemicals that will be going up on the back end of this as we transition from the longer chain PFAS to the shorter chain, from an 8 carbon to a 6 or a 4 carbon. You'll see some of those go up in the body. Hopefully not as toxic, but it really depends on each individual compound. Like I said, drinking water is the one that we want to push the hardest. It's the one where we know drinking and ingestion is your primary route of exposure. We know that associated health outcomes of PFAS exposure can be reduced fertility, higher cholesterol, thyroid disease, liver damage, certain types of cancer, especially with PFOA. Both PFOA and PFOS are have been associated as possible carcinogens. And so that's something that just to keep in the back of your mind. Okay, so let's talk, that's the health piece. Let's talk about the PFAS cycle. So when you talk about PFAS as easily transferred through the environment, this is kind of how it can end up happening. You might end up with a company on the left who may be using PFAS as part of their manufacturing process. They may be using discharging water to the wastewater treatment plant that may have PFAS in it. They may be having spills to the ground, or they may just have a direct discharge through stormwater to the rivers and streams. all of those could potentially have PFAS in them. So you can have a building that may be using PFAS as part of their manufacturing process. It may stick to the roof as a vent or air discharge or a stack emission. And so we know that sometimes the roof, rainwater coming off the roofs of some of these buildings is very, very high because of their manufacturing processes. But our wastewater treatment plants also can't handle PFAS. They do not treat PFAS. So whatever comes into the wastewater treatment plant can go out of the wastewater treatment plant and end up either in our biosolids, in our discharges to our streams and lakes, and or discharges through sludge. So we've been very deliberate in the state of Michigan to try to cut off as many of those industrial sources as possible. And it's really important. We'll go through some of that data here in a minute. Those sources being everything from the manufacturing to the landfills to groundwater pump and treat systems have been some of the highest concentrations that we've seen to wastewater treatment plants. So we've done a really good job with that. We're also monitoring our biosolids. I'll talk about that. But all of these things have a way of potentially getting into groundwater and affecting the drinking water source for millions of homes, especially in the state of Michigan. So Michigan does have our own drinking water standards and our own groundwater cleanup standards. They're the same standards for both drinking water and groundwater, two different programs. And you can see, obviously, PFNA at 6 parts per trillion, all the way up to PFHXA at 400,000. Big difference in the individual compound versus the toxicity of those compounds. So PFHXA is less toxic than PFNA, and hence the much larger standard for PFHXA versus PFNA. We have surface water quality values as well. So these would be values that would be protective of aquatic species as well as human health, especially if the river or stream or lake is being used as a drinking water source, which it is quite often in the Great Lakes area. Do we use our big lakes for drinking water sources? So you'll see those numbers are adjusted down in the case of PFOA to 66 parts per trillion if it's a drinking water source. So MPART, one of our big goals, besides collaboration and communication and coordination between the agencies, is to make sure that we're being transparent. So we've got a pretty robust MPART website, which includes some GIS layers. And so on these layers, you will see we have over 300 MPART sites where we know we have groundwater contamination and a source of PFAS, as well as areas of interest, another 35 areas of interest where we don't know the source, but we do have the groundwater contamination. Surface water samples, public water, those are our municipal water sampling, and fish sampling. And so we've done a lot throughout the state of Michigan in those, and this is all open data for whoever wants to. If you're a researcher and you want to grab this data, go to our MPART website. There's a way to download all of this data for your research. We've done a lot of work in source reduction, sampling most of our wastewater treatment plants in the state. Those wastewater treatment plants then going back and requiring industrial dischargers to also sample upstream before they discharge to the wastewater treatment plants. We've sampled and prioritized our landfills, our military sites, our industrial sites, our AFFF sites. We've also been doing biosolids work, have an interim strategy for biosolids. We've been doing a lot of sampling of stormwater discharges, and then monitoring of our surface water and fish. So what we've seen is in prioritizing our landfills, you'll see a big chunk of these are 90 of our sites are landfills. That's primarily because we prioritized them. So a lot of the high priority landfills were the ones we expected to find PFAS, and we did find PFAS. And so that's why you kind of have a disproportionate number of landfills. But the industrial, chemical, plating, airports, militaries, there's a lot of them on here that we also expected to find PFAS, and we did. And so this is the 300 sites that we have. We also know that those that had to put on pre-treatment before they made their discharges to the wastewater treatment plants, metal finishers, of course, no surprise, metal finishers generally have PFAS contamination. Our contaminated sites are those that had groundwater pump and treat systems that were discharging to a wastewater treatment plant, centralized waste treaters, landfills, AFFF sites, indoor users. So this again isn't too surprising. The highest concentration loading wise were our metal finishers, just because they had pretty high concentrations coming into our wastewater treatment plants. As I said, we've been doing routine and regular monitoring of surface water throughout the state of Michigan for PFAS. We've got over 3,300 different data points in the state for PFAS sampling of surface waters. And if you click on any of these dots, you can actually go to that spot, see what the results are, look at the data. And again, there's a way to access all of the data online. We do statewide sampling of 50 different sites 4 times a year and kind of rotate that through the state on the different watersheds. We also do targeted sampling of 4 to 5 watersheds where we know we've got a source that we need to track. And so, So we do that in a couple different locations every year to try to continue to work on source tracking investigations. Last year, we collected 296 water samples from 9 different watersheds as part of our monitoring. All of that data gives really good data for, just trying to assess the occurrence of PFAS. We combine that with the fish samples. So this is 947. That number is not quite right. In many cases, these same locations have been sampled multiple times. So there's thousands of pieces of data back to the 80s. Now, we didn't really do PFAS sampling until the 2012, 2018, a lot in 2018 to now. But all of the historic data is there because we wanted to make sure people had the data on the mercury, the PCBs, toxophenes, and other things, as well as the PFAS data, just so it's a whole picture. And again, you can download that data. So last year we did 1,300, almost 1,400 fish from 63 different water bodies to be able to update our Eat Safe Fish Guide. And so that will be coming out here in April. But if you haven't looked at our Eat Safe Fish Guide, it does give you fish consumption advisories for every water body in the state. In some of our monitoring, we have actually stumbled across places where it hadn't been routinely monitored, and we get really high concentrations that we were not expecting. In one case, we had a PFOS concentration above our do not eat. And so therefore we issued a do not eat advisory for the pond that we found this in, and said it's a catch and release. So this was a pond where they actually had youth fishing events every year. And so youth fishing isn't a problem, but obviously eating the fish out of this pond would be a problem. So these signs are posted every once in a while when we find that there's a pretty big problem. What we see when we look at the fish are that most of what we're seeing is the L-PFOS, is the linear PFOS. Most of what we find is PFOS in the fish. That is the highest bioaccumulated that we are seeing, followed up by PFDOA and PFDA. And PFUNA, which also have some toxicity, but we don't see them at as high concentrations in the fish. One of the other challenges that we've been struggling with in the more recent years is to try to understand the occurrence of foam on surface water bodies. We're getting pictures and foam sightings across the Great Lakes in various regions of the state, and sometimes in areas where we don't have sources, where we don't think there should be anything that should be causing PFAS contamination or accounting for this foam occurrence. We have done a foam study, a surface water foam study back in 2019, 2020. It is on our website if you want a link of it. 16 different foam samples were collected, mostly in areas where we knew we had really high concentrations, but the surface water concentrations were still down at 4 parts per trillion to 251, but the foam concentrations then at those same samples ranged from 4,957 parts per trillion to 242,000 parts per trillion. We don't have criteria for foam. And often we are asked about public health for foam, but you can just see from this bar graph, you don't have to look at the individual numbers. The blue are all of the surface water, or the foam samples, and the red are the sample concentrations, co-located concentration samples of the surface water. So there's a huge disparity between what we find in surface water versus what you can find in foam. And part of that is because of the physical properties of PFAS. It has a hydrophilic head and a hydrophobic tail. So the head likes to stick in the water and the tail sticks out of the water. And every time there's wind, it generates foam. And so it's that micro layer right at the very top of the air-water interface. And so we see foam often. Does it represent an exposure risk? I think that's still something that needs additional research. And then how do you actually evaluate it as far as a risk assessment? So we do have a way for people to report foam complaints, because we want to know when people see foam so we can see which lakes are continually generating foam. And we have this study here on our MPART PFAS response, FAQs under PFAS foams on lakes and streams. So if you want to take a look at the data there. We do put out a general statewide foam advisory every single year, just reminding people to avoid the foam as much as possible. If you come into contact, rinse it off, bathe as soon as you can, because again, PFAS and PFAS, the family of chemicals, generally have some surfactant properties, so they may stick to your body and you'll want to just wash those off. But just remember, there's lots of other harmful things, including bacteria and chemicals and other things in foam that we wouldn't want you actually playing in it or coming in contact with it, which just makes good sense. But we do still have a lot of research questions on foam. You know, in the absence of an obvious source of foam, why is it continuing to form on lakes? What are those indiscrete, indeterminate type of foam or PFAS sources that we aren't measuring or aren't seeing that might give us foam on lakes? Is there some sort of climate change connection? Because we really got a lot of foam reports this summer and we hadn't had that many. Is there a chance that the septic tanks for the houses around these lakes are actually loading the lake with PFAS, and that's why we're seeing foams on some of these just residential lakes? Is there a harmful algal bloom condition and foam? Do we have any treatment or cleanup technologies out there? Million questions that hopefully somebody in the audience is actually tackling. So I'm going to just briefly touch on some of our health studies that we're doing. DHHS will be here on May 16th. Dr. Jordan Bailey will be talking more about our health studies. But I just want to give you a little preview of some of the stuff that DHHS and MPART are participating in, because it's pretty great stuff and groundbreaking stuff for the state of Michigan to participate in. So we've got one as our PFAS and firefighters of Michigan surveillance. So we've gotten over 1,000 firefighters to enroll in having blood concentrations and understanding their exposure to PFAS in their jobs, as well as potentially in drinking water. And so that I understand is almost in the final phases of report. So we're hoping to see that come out. Did a PFAS exposure and antibody response for COVID. And that was collecting data for people who had been before the immunization for COVID and after, to see if there was any difference in their antibodies and what they were responding to. MyPES is a big one. So our Michigan PFAS Exposure and Health Study is the longitudinal cohort study. We've got over 1,600 people enrolled in that, and we're on our third phase of it. And there is a couple of studies out, report findings out already if you're interested in that. That same group of people then also are participating in a multi-site health study with across the country. It's a national cross-section of people who were exposed to PFAS and what does it mean for the rest of the country, and how will the blood levels of these people correspond with the rest of the country? What does it mean for potential PFAS levels and potential health effects? And here's one of the North Kent exposure assessments that's part of that MyPES study. So that is out if you're interested in something like that. And then before, just so I make sure I leave enough time for other questions, one of the other things that we have as a real challenge for us as we go out and do our MPART work with EGLE and DHHS and our other partners across the state is that we have over 1 million different private drinking water wells in the state. These are residential homes. They are not subject to any regulations for testing or monitoring. And so we have, in some cases, gone out and done precautionary sampling at various locations across the state. And but unfortunately, we often are only getting maybe 50% of the people agreeing to be sampled. So we have a lot of challenges trying to communicate the data, communicate the potential risks, trying to reach the residents. And so I'm sure many of you are out there are nodding your heads going, yep, that's a really big issue, especially in cases where we think they may truly be at risk. We want to be able to get that data and see and assess their potential drinking water risks for having PFAS in their drinking water wells. So just looking at your area, I just pulled up our water well viewer for, got as close to Wayne State as I could and said, okay, so obviously Great Lakes Water Authority services most of the Detroit area, so you do not have too many wells, private drinking water wells, but all the dots with the white outline are the little, what they would call well logic wells on the scale over there are private drinking water wells. These are known drinking water wells within the city and or county, as well as type 2 wells that would be more of the larger capacity wells and or community water supplies, and then type 3 wells, which may be smaller businesses and other things. So we have a lot of wells very close to Detroit. You think about drinking water wells, you may think about, oh, it's the people up north where they don't have municipal water. Well, it's actually a lot of people right in these counties surrounding Detroit. And so these are the people that potentially could be at risk, right, for PFAS contamination. So we always encourage people to go back and look at, what are the MPART sites in your backyard? What are the PFAS sites in your backyard? And obviously in the Detroit area, there's a number of them. There's quite a few down in that area that people could potentially be subject to. But then you also have to add on the layers of, Carol talked today about this center being founded on VOC contamination and metals and other Superfund type contaminants, because PFAS hasn't been investigated for very long, or even designated as a hazardous substance by EPA for very long. So we haven't done that much investigation on PFAS. But we do have other sites of environmental contamination. And when you turn on, this is the state's environmental mapper, or RIDE mapper, as it's now called, you'll see that the underground storage tanks are the green triangles. the Part 201 sites of environmental contamination, which could be just about anything. All your VOC sites and your metals and stuff are the brown squares. And so if you look at what we've got through, this one is of Ann Arbor, we've got a lot of potential sites that overlap where we have these drinking water receptors. So I just want to bring this to your attention because it's not just a PFAS issue. This is a general groundwater issue, but we've got a lot of potential for there to be public health issues in and around people who might be drinking their well water and not having it monitored or sampled. So what we recommend on our MPART website, we have the Well Logic website there for researching your well. So we would encourage people to go out, sample, or look at their well, figure out how deep it is, and then we would encourage them to sample. We've got options for home sampling. They can send away to the EGLE drinking water lab, and they'll send them a self-test kit where they can take a sample, send it back to the lab, and they can get, you know, good, reliable drinking water samples from a certified lab and know if they've got PFAS in their drinking water. If they just want to skip that step and go right to a filter and just filter out what's in their water, they can do that through a carbon filter. Reverse osmosis does work. It does need to be maintained, but you can use that respect. So there's a lot of good information here for the private homeowner in looking at their drinking water wells. So I'll just run through this really quickly because I think we've got enough time to be able to do this. On our website, we've got a whole bunch of stuff for resources for residents. Actually, we've got a lot of stuff. So if you're anywhere in the country, come talk to us because we've got sampling guidance, we've got investigations, we've got public engagement stuff. We've got this resources for residents page, which we're pretty excited about because it does have the PFAS basics as well as those action items that we just talked about: sampling your well, investigating your well, getting a filter, and as well as other people that they can contact. And then we put out a Fast Facts for every fiscal year just to let everybody know how we're spending the money and what we're finding. Our Fast Facts used to be 1 page and now we're up to like 8 pages because there's so much work that goes on. And again, I just go back to the basics of PFAS science is very complex, and trying to communicate all the moving pieces of you know, when it comes to public health, the science, the data collection, the identification and quantification, because we didn't even talk about all the PFAS. We're only looking at 40-ish analytes in the methods. And so we know there's thousands of chemicals out there that we're not even identifying and or quantifying with our laboratory methods. So all of that's a very complex situation. And so I just, you know, we continue to do our best, but we have to, as researchers and collaborators, be really generous with reaching out to our colleagues across the country. And so I know there's a number of these other Superfund centers across the country that are diving into PFAS, and I'm super excited to see you guys doing that, because we can't do this alone. And I think it will truly be up to the states and up to the researchers to continue to push PFAS research and you know, solving these problems together in the coming years. So let me just stop there and see what kinds of questions we've got. Carol, Lynn?
Yeah, Abby, thanks so very much. I'm really glad you also went through the website, the MPART website. If people on the call haven't been to that website yet, I really encourage you to go there. It's amazing how much information there is regarding data that's been collected by the state and different geospatial tools that are there and that you can use to layer on information. I think it's a great example of transparency that we're seeing more so in the state in terms of sharing with researchers and others, that data. So yeah, please go there. I am sure there are many questions, but there is only one that I see right now in the chat, and I want to give that one preference since somebody did use the chat to toss in a question. This is actually a student from one of our graduate level classes in groundwater. Jennifer is asking about the foam. You know, you talked a lot about surface water foams, and she's asking whether your belief is that that's usually from firefighting foams.
It's yes and no. AFFF foams can obviously cause, release foam and be a potential cause of it. But I think what we're seeing in a lot of these surface water bodies is lots of little sources of PFAS all congregating together. So, you will have, again, I'll go back to the septic tanks. If you are a homeowner on a lake where you have, maybe a 50-foot or 100-foot lot, your septic tank's not that far from the lake. And generally speaking, your septic tank's probably going to be getting into the lake one way or another. So everything that you put in that septic tank, whether you know it, if it contains PFAS or not, is probably going to have that ability to not just get into the septic tank, but then migrate out of the septic tank. And so my hypothesis is that, and I'm hoping somebody's doing research on this, but my hypothesis is that what we're seeing is that the contribution of many little homes around these lakes where, they don't have sewers. So those contributions are all causing, a buildup of PFOS in those lakes. So, because there's just, in a lot of cases, there's no other potential sources out there that we see around these lakes that could be causing foam contributions. So, yeah. In some cases, maybe you will have had a house on fire or something like that where you can actually pinpoint some sort of an AFFF release, but most of the Class A AFFF has very low concentrations of PFAS or no concentrations. We know that some Class A foams that they use for fighting fires in wood structures, such as houses and stuff, have very low concentrations of PFAS. We won't say that there's no PFAS, but it's much lower concentrations than what you would see for what we call Class B AFFF, which would be for the tanker fires, for the petroleum fires, for jet fuels, for, those kinds of things where you really have hot fires that need a really good blanket of PFAS to smother out those fires. Hopefully that answered her question.
I think it did. If there are other questions, it's fine to have people just sort of raise your hand or maybe yeah,
Steve wants to ask a question.
Thanks so much. Lovely talk, and what a wonderful website. We do a lot of web work here, so I can just imagine how much of pain and effort there is to go into this much volume. And so it's just wonderful, and I can't wait to go and download all your data. My question actually is, how many hits are you getting, or what is the public interest in engaging with this material? Because it's pretty technical just in general. So I'm just curious of, hopefully people are interested, but what's your experience there?
Yeah, great question. Last time we looked, which was middle of last year, maybe last fall, we were getting about 15,000 hits a month.
Wonderful. That's great.
The interesting part of it for me is that at least 50% of those were mostly from out of state.
Really?
So, yeah, it's one of the, besides the ITRC, it's one of the more robust locations for PFAS information. And so we get a lot of people that come out there and look at our sampling guidance, looking at our work on biosolids, our work on fish, downloading the data and stuff. So, yeah.
Well, wonderful. It's an inspiration. So thank you so much.
Yeah, definitely. Go ahead, Paul. Oops, you got it.
Paul, you're muted.
Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry about that, and thanks for filling me in. Thanks for the talk. I was really glad to see the graph where the levels are falling over the years. And does that represent a decrease in the burden the environment has, or is it that more that people are not having the input from more direct sources, such as if we're avoiding direct sources that we would come in through from consumer goods?
Yeah, this is mostly going to be, where'd I put that one? Going to be associated with the blood levels of humans. We tend to, especially for PFOS, hold on to PFOS for a fairly long time. It has a half-life of somewhere between 5 to 7 years. But for fish, their half-life cycle for fish is much less, like weeks instead of years. And so we know that if we can clean up rivers, and so we've seen a really direct correlation between the surface water data that we've had and the fish data we have, where we've had really impacted surface waters, and we've put those industrial treatments on the industries that are discharging into the wastewater treatment plants. We can see the downstream effects of the surface water concentrations going down, and then the next year the fish concentrations going down. So we know there's direct correlation between putting that treatment on and keeping things out of the wastewater treatment plants to actually being able to see noticeable effects in the fish. And then we of course say, you know, there's going to should be noticeable effects in the people that are eating those fish, right? So, but it's going to be a much longer timeline. So I think everything has its own. I don't know the half-life for mammals or birds or deer, that kind of thing, although we do have some of that. We've got some studies on deer that's on our Fish and Wildlife page. So, but yeah, I think that's hopefully answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much. Can I follow up with something completely different?
Sure.
sure.
So I was struck at the difference in concentration of the foams versus the bodies of water that those foams reside on, and it seemed that in your talk you said that the foams are generated because of the molecular nature of the PFAS, and that that wind has something to do with direct on the surface causing a foam structure to be developed, and
Yes.
and it's like hundreds of thousands of times different that you were showing there, I thought, in the actual concentration. And is this something that would be useful as a way to concentrate and remove PFAS from bodies of water, or is there more of a capture in like a charcoal matrix that's going to be more effective?
Great question. And yes, they're actually are already doing that. So this is the reason that PFOS made a great firefighting foam, because it foamed very easily. It made this great structure on this, you know, micro layer, the micelle layer across the water body, and it created this blanket across a fire to be able to put out the fire and suffocate it. Well, it does the same thing on our water bodies, and so it floats at the top of the water table. PFOS does, because of that structure and because of the hydrophilic head and the hydrophobic tail. So what they've done for treatment technologies is they're taking groundwater that's contaminated, or any kind of landfill leachate, or any kind of a discharge water that may have PFAS in it, and they're injecting air and getting those bubbles to rise to the top, and they're skimming off the bubbles. And so they call that foam fractionation. There's probably I don't know, probably 5, maybe 10 different companies out there now doing foam fractionation as a remediation technique for groundwater or surface water or any kind of wastewater. That's been very effective. They've been able to use that property of PFOS to super concentrate PFAS, and then they take that, obviously the water part of it, and they can send that back to the wastewater treatment plant with much less PFAS in it. And then they can just continue to super concentrate this. They then take the foam fractionation concentrate, and that's what they send off for destruction work.
Mhm.
In order to actually
Sounds like that
do
could be a
cleanup.
relatively low cost approach to pulling the PFAS out.
It depends on a lot of the influent stuff coming in. Landfill leachate's always going to be harder to deal with than contaminated groundwater. The other stuff that's in the water can sometimes interfere with the ability of that stuff to get bubbled up to the top. Foam fractionation's been pretty easy when it comes to PFAS destruction. That has been a lot more challenging, but there is processes out there called supercritical water oxidation, and SQO we call it for short, but there's probably again another 5 different vendors out there that have some sort of a SQO system that can take PFAS concentrate and actually bring it up to a supercritical water temperature and pressure to actually totally destabilize the molecule and create a situation where water becomes a solvent, breaks apart all of those molecules, and then destroys PFAS. Not cheap, pretty high intensity energy usage in that process, but they are using it down in Ohio to try to treat most of the state's stockpile of AFFF from the fire departments and other stuff. So we're watching to see how that's going. I think the technology is there, but every single foam AFFF formulation, they didn't keep it the same over time, so every single one is a little bit different. It requires just a little bit of tweaking as they go through the treatment technology development to make sure they're getting the proper balance of treatment for that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hey, thanks so much. We've got a couple more questions coming in, and just would like to get to as many as possible. Yeah, Lara is asking, she states, and this is in the chat if you wanted to see it, one of your studies showed that common lab equipment such as Sharpie markers have PFAS. Are you hearing of any changes manufacturers are making to address this, to make it easier to avoid PFAS in the laboratory setting?
Yeah, so the first thing is we're finding that the cross-contamination issue for field sampling is not as much of an issue as we first feared. So yes, we're trying to avoid using PFAS while we're out in the field collecting the PFAS samples because we're talking about parts per trillion. So you definitely want to do that. But yes, there's lots of manufacturers that have done PFAS testing so that we can ensure that PFAS is not part of our sampling protocol when we go out to collect the samples. On a bigger scale, yes, Minnesota is currently enacting consumer products ban for PFAS. And so if you want to sell products within the state of Minnesota, they can't contain PFAS. And so that by itself has generated, this is being done in Minnesota, in Maine, and somewhat in Washington. And so that has generated tons of industries and manufacturers to look again at their products and see where they have PFAS, where they don't have PFAS. Do they have intentionally added PFAS, or is it unintentionally added PFAS? Because you may just be packaging something on a line that was packaging something PFAS before, and it may not be intentionally added to your product, but it's getting some PFAS from something as it goes through the line. So yeah, there's lots of work in that particular thing. We could do a whole nother conversation about that one.
Thanks so much. This next question maybe will be addressed by Dr. Jordan, who comes in May, but maybe you want to say a few things.
Yeah.
This is from Dr. Ding. Can PFAS cross placenta and reach the fetus?
Yes, absolutely. I'm sure there's, and I'm not, let me just state right now, I'm not a toxicologist, I'm not an epidemiologist, but yeah, Dr. Jordan Bailey, she can definitely talk about this when she comes in May. We know that PFAS do cross the placenta, reach the fetus. We know that the concentrations in our newborns can be much, much higher than they are in the mothers because of that, you know, super concentration of blood and stuff that's for developing the fetus. Don't quote me on this, but I thought one of the studies from early Minnesota did some of this assessment, was saying like 7 times more in the newborn's body than what is in the mother's. And so, yeah, there's definitely that hyper concentration of PFAS in young developing bodies. And I think that goes for rat studies as well as humans.
Wow. Scary and interesting.
But definitely ask that question in May when she comes back.
Yeah. Dr. Westrick is asking about dissolved air flotation is an accepted drinking water treatment. Has anyone looked at this to see if it can work on PFAS?
You know, I've heard about it, but I haven't seen much talk about it for PFAS. And I would think that if the industry is going great guns and trying to understand PFAS treatment, it has not been promoted as one of those easier methods.
And I think actually what
Yeah.
she's getting at even more so is whether anybody's looked at the waste product from dissolved air flotation to see if
Oh,
it has high levels of PFAS.
I've not heard of that. I've not heard of that. That might be something that'd be good for a study, because I've not heard anything about that.
And then like Thompson is noting, when the state analyzes well water, does it also assess the presence of particular VOCs?
No. So when MPART gets involved, so we have done proactive sampling around all of our airports. If the airport was big enough that it was required to have AFFF training and or AFFF on the airport because of its use of commercial FAA regulations, then we went around and we actually looked at which drinking water wells would be closest to the airport, which ones would be shallowest, and then did PFAS sampling. We have not looked for VOCs as a normal course of business, because most of those sites, or most of our other sites, would have already been analyzing for VOCs as part of the normal environmental cleanup process. So we haven't done that, but occasionally we will contemplate it in various situations, but not in a normal course.
Great. Well, I think the last comment is one that is almost, you know, tailor-made for us to end on. Carrie Leach says, thank you for recording this presentation. It will be very useful for the CURES community, as well as the CLEAR community, for community education in the future. So here at Wayne State, we have both the CLEAR Center and the CURES Center, both dealing with contaminants in an urban environment. So thank you very much, Abby. This has been a really robust session, and it's touched a lot of things that our group is interested in. And Melissa, do you want to add anything here at the end? You're on mute. Melissa, you're on mute.
Okay, I had to get it off. Thanks again, Abby, for taking time from your busy day. I know you're doing 100 things, and yet this kind of information is so important to all of us.
Yes.
So keep in there, keep working.
All right, excellent. Well, and I'm depending on you guys as researchers to keep the research and the data coming, because there's a million more questions we could be answering and researching. So thanks to all of you for your hard work too.
Thank you.
All right.
Right,
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Yeah, okay,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye.
Thanks to everybody who attended. Bye-bye.
Bye.
For everyone logged off, remember that our next presentation, our next seminar is going to be on the 13th of February. And that's going to be with Dr. Janessa Wajenka. She'll be discussing an overview for community members on uterine fibroids. So join us, go to events.wayne.edu to get a link to that Zoom meeting.
Okay.
Thank you.